Hello, I'm Dr. Simone Gold, founder of America's Frontline Doctors, and I have a question for you. A question that to most people sounds obvious. A question that seems perhaps too simple. A question that almost seems unnecessary. But I challenge you to take a second and try to answer it, earnestly. What is a doctor? I should know, I practiced as an emergency room physician for over 20 years. Handling a spectrum of patients and a myriad of ailments. I have a degree. I wore a stethoscope. I own a white coat. Yet, in a post-COVID world, it's become apparent that not everyone agrees on what it means to be a doctor, what exactly it entails. Some of you now perhaps have lost confidence in our medical institutions and have been left with serious doubts about what a doctor really is. You would be 100% correct in feeling this way. Our medical industry has objectively been compromised in more ways than one. You may not have been able to pinpoint exactly what's wrong, but the corruption can be felt, and it does show itself if you're paying attention. One of the insidious trends that has been simmering in the shadows for several decades and is only now hitting mainstream awareness is the medical mutilation procedures coming from the gender ideology camp. This movement has accelerated so aggressively that many have fallen victim due to our trust in first world medicine. But it begs us to re-examine what it means to wear a white coat, what it means to take the Hippocratic Oath. It begs the question, what is a doctor? I've gathered together some of the leading voices in medicine to discuss this question in detail and what to do about the current misappropriation of our medical industry.
So I'm very interested in the subject of what is a doctor, because when I spoke up in 2020, it was specifically because I was a doctor, I was a daughter of a doctor, and I had been raised to think that being a doctor was the best thing a person could be. I mean, I don't think being president of the United States would have been considered a higher honor. So I grew up thinking being a doctor, saving life, was the most important thing a person could do. And then I saw 2020 and I was really disappointed in doctors. I didn't think that doctors really stood up for their patients, and I think it's multifactorial, et cetera. But what does being a doctor mean to you personally, Dr. Jensen?
I think the last 4 years we've seen patients endure abandonment, and I think they feel betrayed. I've said so many times to my patients, if life is a boxing match and you're in the arena and you get a bloody nose or you get a cut above your eye and you're bleeding and you can't see very well, you come over to the corner to the trainer, and that trainer helps pants you up so that you can go back out into the arena. I sort of feel like I'm the trainer. I'm not there to take over and go do the boxing for the patient. I'm there to be that resource at their side. When they come over to the corner, I'm not putting my value system on them. I'm saying, how can I help? Mm-hmm. And I think that we've lost some of that.
And Dr. Melanie Kreitz-Bachert, what does being a doctor mean to you?
As you said, I always felt like it was the highest honor because we are responsible for people's lives. Somebody comes to us when they are the most vulnerable. And for me, taking that sacred trust and giving that person the truth, laying everything out in what we call informed consent, the good, the bad, the ugly, and allowing the patient to make a decision with my guidance. We have an obligation to our patients to tell the truth as we learned it and as we know it, and to not distort that and politicize it.
Thank you very much. So Dr. Hayim, as the same question, I was very appreciative of you all joining me today because we represent different specialties and we represent different geographic areas of the country and also different ages. So you are the youngest of our group and you were going through your surgical residency training during the COVID years, which I'm sure influenced you, and we'll get to that. But what does being a doctor mean to you?
When I was in training, I remember taking care of these really sick kids at the Children's Hospital, kids with chronic medical conditions. These were frequent flyers where they would constantly come into the hospital. And that was our job, right? They would come in and we would have to do anything possible to get them back to a normal life. And it would take a long time. And you would get to know these kids too. And you would see that they were just like anyone else. You think that because they're so sick, they must not be able to imagine that they can live a normal life, but they do, right? They just want to ride bikes with their friends. They just want a girlfriend. They want to go to high school and go to prom, and their parents want that too so badly. And when we would take these kids to the operating room, it was so painful because you knew that they were going to be in for it afterwards. But ultimately, the satisfaction of seeing some of these kids go home, right, going through this huge experience, so much pain and suffering. But then you see them a couple weeks after they go home and they're like, they're just a regular kid. So, but what that really was is you're taking a really sick kid and you're making them healthy so that they can go back home and live a normal life.
So I enjoy this because we're getting a little different slice from each of you. So you were saying being a doctor is like being a trainer, which is almost like a coach, and you're there to support them in their moment of need. From you, I heard more being a doctor is more of being an educator. And from you, I heard more being a doctor is really a healer. And I don't know if you all thought about it that way, but you very naturally gravitated towards three slants of what I think being a doctor is. I always thought being a doctor was having superior knowledge, and I don't mean that in any arrogant way, but you go to school for 10 years to possess that superior knowledge. You have superior knowledge, but the knowledge itself, I don't believe, is inherently good or bad. It could be used for good or used for evil, and I always felt the doctors were using their superior knowledge for good, and then I got a little bit alarmed during COVID and now the transgender, wondering if doctors are taking what should be a neutral positive thing, which is this superior knowledge, and using it for evil, is not what I want to do as a doctor. So I appreciate hearing the trainer, educator, and healer.
As I heard my esteemed colleagues describe this noble picture of what a doctor should be, I couldn't help but be reminded of how this notion that all doctors should be trusted and revered is a relatively modern concept. This cultural idea only began to crystallize a little less than 100 years ago due to incredible medical advances. With the advent of antibiotics and many new sophisticated procedures, modern medicine was at times miraculous. Interestingly, until the 1800s, hospitals were not viewed as beacons for healing, but as final destinations where the sick and injured met their end. The unsanitary conditions often did more harm than good. As the 19th century progressed, so too did our understanding of medicine. The introduction of anesthesia and sanitation transformed hospitals from places of dread to centers of hope. By the early 1900s, the rise of medical schools and the spread of groundbreaking discoveries began to change perceptions. Doctors were seen as the portal to newfound remedies. The post-war boom of the mid-20th century marked a golden era for medicine in America. Hospitals expanded, and the doctor-patient relationship evolved into a personal, almost familial bond. Trust in doctors reached its zenith, with surveys from the 1980s showing nearly 80% of Americans held their physicians in high regard. But as the century turned, this trust faced new challenges. The system began to rapidly bloat with a complex web of insurance policies and government interventions. This rise in corporate healthcare began to erode the sacred trust once placed on individual caregivers. Prior to this, most doctors were small business owners. In the early 1980s, roughly 75% of doctors ran independent practices. Today, this is completely flipped with nearly 80% of physicians classified as employees in 2024. As such, these physicians are beholden to marching orders coming from corporate overseers, be they insurance companies or even the federal government. The massive mishandling of COVID was a pivotal point in this conversation. Before 2020, no one thought to question, what is a doctor, or do I trust my doctor? Dr. Anthony Fauci in particular was emblematic of how this trust was corroded. The vaccine misinformation was apparent, and the overt suppression of viable alternatives did not go unnoticed. For Americans who were following independent, alternative voices, it was clear early on that there was a massive misinformation campaign that led to a mass formation psychosis. Many more people eventually caught up to the deceit that was transpiring, but unfortunately for many, it was too late. The damage was done. The trust had been broken. Today, we stand at a crossroads. Recent surveys show a stark decline in trust, with only about 40% of Americans fully trusting their doctors. But maybe another question worth asking is not only what is a doctor, but who is a doctor? Who is serving this role of a trusted trainer, educator, and healer? What does that person look like exactly? What kind of credentials are really necessary? Does a medical degree automatically give someone credence today? The public would like to know.
I think there's a transformation taking place in the public's perception of what is a doctor. You don't have to necessarily be MD. I think many people are participating in that process of selecting who do they want to be their doctor. Is it going to be a physician or a naturopath or a personal trainer?
Right, and so I've been aware of this for a long time, that we've medicalized a lot of situations, right? I remember, I've got 2 children, and I remember when I was pregnant, I definitely thought a midwife was superior to a doctor than an OBGYN. And for one thing, I don't know many gynecologists that want to sit with a woman in labor for 20 hours. That's just not how right? That's not our temperament. So I do also just want to throw out there that perhaps America has medicalized certain situations that don't best belong in a physician's purview. Clearly in areas like urological surgery and general surgery, obviously you must be a physician and surgeon for those things, but just to broaden our understanding.
10 years ago, people might not have felt the need to ask that question. But I think that truly, with what happened with the pandemic over the last 4 years, there's a suspicion, a hesitation, a skepticism, a loss of trust, a generalized milieu of confusion that's causing people to say, what is a doctor? Because if a doctor's Tony Fauci and he said this, this, and this, and then later on said not, that's a problem. And I think the other issue really has been medical mutilation. You're talking about a very, very small percentage of the population really driving the discussion and literally taking the oxygen out of the room in terms of other issues that we face as a society as well.
We already have a generation of youth who we are touting, or I should say, not we, but the medical complex, we are failing them because we are presenting to them a quick fix, which is what our society has become. We are not teaching coping skills for the day-to-day adversities that are normal with developing and with childhood and with teenagers. We are performing surgeries on these children that have neither the capacity to make these life-changing decisions nor the wisdom to know the difference. And we are telling them, this is your quick fix-all. And we are creating complications that require multiple surgeries. And the only people benefiting is the medical industrial complex, because the more surgeries that are done, the more money is made.
If someone came into my clinic and said, Dr. Heim, I want you to take my arm off because I believe I was born that way. If I did that, a situation happened similar to that not too long ago. And of course I had to refuse. The reason is because it's a psychological issue that I would be treating with a physiological solution. Mm-hmm. If I did that, I would lose my license and likely go to prison. But in this case, there's a cutout for it. And the reason there's a cutout is because from the beginning, it was political.
Dr. Itam Heim knows all too well that this issue is indeed political. As an undergrad in medical school, Heim focused his studies on general surgery and subsequently did his residency at Baylor College of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical colleges in the United States. He started his training in 2018.
I feel like in the beginning, you saw the apex of American medicine, where you have all the ideals that American medicine was directed towards manifesting in the treatment of the sickest people. People would come in with these massive problems. We would treat them and they would go home. We would cut them from here to here, replace their entire aorta, the biggest vessel in their body, do these amazing surgeries. But at the time I didn't really realize, but there was a sickness that had been afflicting the profession for a long time. And I feel like that it came to a head ultimately in March of 2020 with COVID, where the medical institution in our country, but then also so many other institutions, had become completely corrupted, but specifically by adopting an ideology and it's this belief that truth is subjective. It's not something you observe in the world, but rather you determine yourself, that there are no rules beyond your control. If you say something is true, that is what's true. And that's a bad idea when you hear it in a college classroom, but it's like if it's guiding a doctor's recommendations, that's a big problem.
It was very upsetting as a physician to see other physicians going along with factually untrue statements and actions. So you and I knew, and the whole profession knew, that surgical masks, ordinary surgical masks, do not keep out tiny respiratory viruses. That is not debatable. That the pore size in the mask is about 1,000 times the size of a virus, which is the SARS-2 virus is 0.1 micron in size. So it was very upsetting. You and I had the same experience, that we're watching people visually that we can see are complying with things that we knew were factually false.
Yes, and I saw the before and after too, because I saw people who were the most skeptical. I mean, if they saw anything that they thought didn't make sense, they would call it out. But then after that, everyone just went silent. It was like a blanket, like some type of, fog had affected every person in my department.
This fog, of course, was the mass formation psychosis surrounding COVID. The willful ignorance and casual cruelty that we saw normalized in the medical world was unprecedented in scale. People were tragically and needlessly hurt, and at worst suffered death at the hands of the so-called experts. And all too often, they would die completely alone.
Because when a patient dies, there's usually that semicircle of the people they love the most. The moment they die and ascend to a place that's greater, the people they love the most will be there for that moment. And to see these people die alone without them was the most horrifying thing, and especially the kids. To see what these kids were going through, with lockdowns and with the masks and how much suffering, where we would have kids come in so much more frequently with these horrific signs of abuse. And you become familiar with the sound a mother makes when you tell her that her child is dead because of this abuse that was happening, because kids were not in schools to be able to identify it beforehand. And even though I tried to push back during that time, I was still part of it. I still saw these patients die alone, right? And the guilt of that was the worst thing I could have ever imagined. And it's like I was very angry, and I'm not an angry person by disposition. I'm the opposite. I'm like a very easygoing guy. But it was this anger, and it was getting worse and worse. And then I saw this happening where the biggest children's hospital in the world was lying to the public, the people they're taking care of, about a program that was manipulating, mutilating, and sterilizing confused adolescent children.
In March of 2022, the Texas Children's Hospital issued a public statement saying they were shutting down their transgender program due to potential criminal liability. Prior to this, the Texas Attorney General issued an opinion stating that these interventions could be considered child abuse. The Texas Children's Hospital complied, or so it seemed.
I knew, despite their outward statement, I knew that this was a lie. And I mean, that's the thing, is I didn't believe it, because for months. So more and more people came up to me. They're like, yeah, we're putting in these puberty blocking devices in these young kids. But I still didn't believe it, because how is it that the biggest children's hospital in the world would do something they acknowledged was potentially criminal? It just seemed so outlandish. But then it was in January of 2023 that all doubt was eliminated. There was something called a Grand Rounds lecture. It usually happens every week, the most prestigious lecture series in the hospital. The topics they choose are the ones that the hospital is prioritizing. The directors of the transgender program, the one that they had said shut down, were given the opportunity to speak at this lecture series, where they talked about their algorithmic approach to hormones and blockers, the multidisciplinary clinic, right? How to ask about gender identity behind the backs of their parents, how to hide the gender identity from the parents, all on video. And then there was a Zoom conference 2 weeks after that. Multiple members of the transgender clinic, of course the one that doesn't exist, with 150 medical students, like a huge group.
This is incredible.
And there was a social worker who talked about how she would conceal evidence of the program from the state of Texas. So instead of documenting consults, she would call them in. And she says, I specifically don't give parents paperwork in order to prevent that, on video. And the currency we use as doctors is trust, right? That's the only currency we have. If we violate that trust, then we can't really call ourselves doctors.
Dr. Heim started reaching out to journalists, and in mid-May of 2023, Christopher Rufo's interest was piqued. Acting as an anonymous whistleblower, he worked with Rufo to vet and corroborate about the dark reality transpiring at the largest children's hospital in the world. The story was published on May 16th, one day before the Texas Senate held a vote for SB 14. This bill would determine whether or not these interventions are legal. The story was a bombshell. It sent ripples to news outlets around the country, and the following day, the Texas Senate outlawed these interventions with bipartisan support.
So that happens, and then the Attorney General announces an investigation into the hospital, and then the CEO says he's shutting down in accordance with SB 14 the second time in 14 months. Right. After that, everything goes quiet.
After 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and 5 years of surgical residency, Dr. Heim was nearing the end of his medical training. A little over a month had passed since the Texas Senate ruling. It was Friday, June 23rd, the day of his graduation.
My wife and I are getting ready at our apartment, and maybe around 11, 12 o'clock, all of a sudden get an aggressive knock on the door. I'm like, man, that's weird, right? That's odd. So I shuffle over, open the door. Standing outside are 2 armed agents with Health and Human Services. They show me their badges and tell me they're investigating a case regarding medical records. I kind of freak out in the moment. I knew why they were there, right? Like, we had challenged the dominant political ideology, and this had run counter to the ideology coming out of DC. Before leaving, they hand me a target letter, just a sheet of paper, informing me that I was a potential target of a criminal investigation, and it was signed by an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of Texas. I had myself, like a while before, already signed a contract in a really small town. We were going to move to a small town just to live a quiet life, raise a family. That was our intention. So I wanted none of this. But over the next 6 months, between June of 2023 and January of 2024, the corruption we experienced was so deep, so profound, that I knew that they were going to destroy me I knew that they were going to destroy me regardless. If they were going to do this anyway, then I was going to tell the truth. I was going to go public.
Are you, just to be reflective for a moment, are you a parent? You have a wife?
Yeah, I have. My first daughter is on the way in October, and they're going to try to send me away for 10 years in federal prison. So I might miss the birth of my first daughter. For telling the truth, for exposing the fact that the largest children's hospital in the world was lying to their patients about a program that was harming these children, right? For fulfilling my oath as a doctor, they're going to try to put me away for 10 years. That's scary, right? It's terrifying. But the more terrifying thing is to think that I'm going to deliver my daughter into a world where there are people who are unwilling to stand up for what's right. That's a more terrifying thing.
It was clear that my colleagues had an ethical stance on what our job should entail: to be a trainer, to be a healer, to be an educator, to truly be a servant with a higher calling that firstly does no harm. They believe this so fervently that many have been willing to not only lose their livelihoods, but also their way of life. Clearly, we're in a mess. But how did we get here? How have ideologues gained so much ground in our medical industry? For that, I knew no one better to talk to than Dr. Miriam Grossman, and posed to her the same question. What is a doctor?
Well, first of all, I would say that a doctor has to be grounded in reality and truth, and has to be prepared to represent that reality and truth with their patients, no matter how hard it is.
So for Dr. Grossman, being a doctor is being a truth teller.
Dr. Miriam Grossman is a board-certified child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist. A medical physician, she has seen thousands of patients at her clinic for more than 35 years. She recently pivoted her practice to only help teenagers who are experiencing distress about their sex. She helps both the patient and their parents, as this is a massive crisis that encompasses the entire family.
We're very invested in 2024 in the transgender questions and gender dysphoria. But when you started, how prevalent a subject was this subject?
Okay. So you're right. This is something people must understand. When I was a resident, an intern, a medical student, and I heard about this condition, which was then called gender identity disorder, it was so rare that we all just considered it something, in the books, in the textbooks. Gender identity disorder in the past was primarily in boys and men. 20 years ago, Dr. Gold, there were only 3 clinics that existed in order to help these families with kids who had gender identity disorder. 3 clinics in the whole world. And those clinics were seeing maybe 10 kids a year. And now we have a situation, for example, the gender identity disorder service in London, the Tavistock Clinic, that was recently shut down because it was shown that what they were doing was simply unsafe. They had their most recent data from a few years ago. There were over 5,000 referrals in that year.
When I was in medical school and in training, this was not only very, very rare, not only really kind of like middle-aged men who've been cross-dressing for a long time, but there were no children. And if there was I'm not saying there was no children with gender dysphoria ideas, but in terms of medicalizing them, it was verboten. You understood and were told by all professional societies, we don't do this with children. Now you're having an entirely different population present itself, and we're still calling it gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
We're saying people who are mostly female, who are coming up with this, very, very quickly, post-adolescence, not as like little children, etc. But we're calling it the same thing. And I think that that's a language problem. I think it's a collusion. I can't figure out why we're calling this gender dysphoria. It should be, in my mind, rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Rapid onset is kids who were, most of them, completely comfortable with their bodies. They may have been tomboys, they may have been feminine boys, but they were fine with their bodies. And then all of a sudden, because they've been exposed to this idea left and right, and because there's secondary gain that's involved, in other words, it's called kind of social gains from it, and they're, that they choose to explore it, and it's encouraged, and they may have heard about it from their guidance counselor. I've had patients who tell me that they never even heard of such a thing until they sat down with a guidance counselor because they were anxious or depressed, and the guidance counselor said, have you ever thought that maybe you're a boy? You're actually a boy? And it all starts from there.
What do you say to critics and naysayers who would say that increase is solely or mainly due to a more willingness to look at the issue?
Okay. If we always had that degree, that percentage of the population that had deep and long-standing distress about being male or female, and now things are more open and accepting, why are we not seeing an epidemic of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s coming out and saying, okay, now I can be honest with everyone? We are not seeing that kind of epidemic. We're seeing an epidemic of young people, of teenagers and young adults. The next thing I would say is that studies in countries such as the Netherlands, the approach has been very open, and the general population has been very tolerant and accepting. We still see the high degree of mental illness in this population, the high numbers of suicidal behaviors and successful suicides, even though the culture has progressively been more and more accepting.
So clearly there's been an unsettling uptick in sex change procedures involving minors in the past few years. This begs the question, what elements are at play here that have expedited the process for what was once a very slow-moving process involving adults? Has the concept of informed consent been thrown wayward? This bedrock idea desperately needed a re-examination.
When you think about informed consent, you have two parties responsible. You have the consenting party and then the informing party. Because medicine has, over the past couple of generations, been oriented in the proper direction, for the most part, right, with detours that cannot be ignored, we have forgotten the responsibilities of the informing individual, the doctor. It's not just a form, right? It's because I don't know any patient that's ever really read the informed consent. They maybe just look to where they can sign it and then be done, but it's really that conversation. Like, informed consent is a conversation that occurs between a doctor and a patient. It's like the formification of informed consent is what has led to its ultimate destruction. We can't even call this informed consent when the doctors themselves are fundamentally misinformed about the pathologies they're intervening on. They're treating a psychological issue with physiological solutions. But in that clinic room, the reason these people are consenting to it is because a picture is being painted that if you don't undergo these interventions, right, what's the risk? This child is going to kill themselves. The worst possible thing. So they're being blackmailed with their existential destruction. If you're blackmailed with that, you'll consent to anything. When you have doctors that are informing people that they have to hate themselves, that the name that they were originally given is their dead name, that they have to be reliant on drugs, on hormones, on surgeries in order to be their original self, you're misinforming someone.
I think children are being offered some sort of a panacea or a cure-all for what's going on in their mind. I think there's a tension. Viktor Frankl, in his book, The Man's Search for Meaning, talks about the necessity of that tension within us as we grow up, as we go through the various stages of concrete sequential thinking and ultimately moving to abstract thinking. But I think children are being offered an answer, and it's being presented to them as sort of a package deal. And I just don't see how, whether you're talking about an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 14-year-old, I don't see how you can actually derive informed consent from that age group.
I believe there's no true informed consent, even if they say to an 11-year-old boy, you'll never have an orgasm, because he has no idea when he says, well, I don't care. He has no idea what he's saying he doesn't care about, let alone you'll never have biological children. Oh, I'll adopt. No idea what they're giving up.
I have concluded that it is a legal impossibility to obtain informed consent from children on these issues. That our United States government, courts, laws have to hold that it's legally impossible for a minor child to consent to things to which they can't possibly understand.
And the doctors doing this realize that. Dr. Daniel Metzger, a Canadian endocrinologist, who is giving these kids the blockers and the cross-sex hormones, and he readily admits this, and he says, you know, we all know this. We all know that when we can talk our heads off, we can talk ourselves blue in the face with a teenager about their fertility and about having children, and they just say, oh, I don't care, it's fine, I want to do this. We all know that we can't be getting true informed consent.
Yeah.
We're simply using it as a box to check. Informed consent was provided, now we get to do what we want. To me, that's the biggest danger
Right.
that the public is speaking to. They're saying, you're trying to oversimplify the tension that exists in almost every kid growing up. Girls are uncomfortable with boys, and boys are uncomfortable with girls, and boys are uncomfortable with boys, and girls are uncomfortable with girls. And you know what? Welcome to the human race.
Dr. Melanie Kreitz-Balkart, a seasoned pelvic reconstruction surgeon, understands the weight of informed consent, especially as it relates to sex change procedures. As an educator, she takes it upon herself to be as clear and comprehensive as possible with any patient about what they are signing up for when they decide to undergo any procedure. Although she has personally decided to not participate in sex reassignment surgeries, she knows full well what should be expected and the potential complications.
So generally it starts with hormonal manipulation. Once a biological female is exposed to high levels of testosterone, the clitoris will grow. It will become large enough to become the head of the penis. You would have to take a graft from a different part of the body or fashion a penis and scrotum from the labia. So some surgeons will graft like a radial arm flap.
So you're saying that they take skin, muscle from the arm.
From the arm and fashion a penis out of that.
And you know, the thing about the graft too is this is a full thickness graft. So it's not just the most superficial layer of your skin, like a split thickness skin graft, but full thickness. Yes. Where you're losing cosmetic appearance and function. Mm-hmm. So what's happening is almost what's like the opposite of a reconstructive surgery. You're taking someone with a psychological issue and then you're creating a physiological problem, right? Yeah. Both at the graft site and then also in their genitalia.
Over 90% of the time, the person has to undergo physical therapy because the nerves can be damaged. The skin becomes very tight and can be very painful. The patient can lose function of their hand. So lots of times they would have to undergo physical therapy just to regain the function of their extremity, which can be terrifically painful, but also there's no guarantee that they would be able to regain full function of their upper extremity.
How successful is this procedure at giving the result that the patient is hoping for?
There's upwards of 70% of patients who cannot have penetrative sex. And if they can, that's generally the result of a prosthetic. You have to put a mechanical device inside of it, which then subjects you to more surgeries later on. A mechanical device is just that. One or all parts of that will malfunction at some point in time, needing replacement. Okay. A study from last year, 2023, February of 2023, from the Journal of Sexual Medicine, stated that greater than 75% of male to female transitioners had loss of orgasm. That's a staggering number. You are committing yourself to multiple surgeries throughout your life for complications such as fistula, which is a connection between the urethra, which is where urine comes out of the body. That is a connection between the urethra and another organ, such as the rectum, or the urethra and the skin, or the rectum and the skin.
And it's important to know what that means. Like that connection between like the rectum and the urethra the manifestation of that is people will urinate stool. Mm-hmm. I see that in other cases like diverticulitis, right? Yeah. When people have these chronic fistulas. And think about how painful that would be. Chronic recurrent infections.
If we could just kind of quickly go through the reverse, the biological male who wants to have a gender identity of female.
So that would also start with hormonal manipulation to feminize the body. The penis and scrotum would have to be fashioned into a vagina. If the penis and scrotum cannot be fashioned into that to get the length and or depth of the vagina, sometimes, again, you have to harvest a graft from some other place, and that could be from the colon, which then also brings another whole host of problems because the colon and a biological female vagina create two different types of mucus, two different types of bacteria inhabit that.
It's absolutely horrifying. As someone who works on colon, it's horrifying to think, and they do that in some cases, and it's unimaginable. But it when you think about what they're doing surgically, they say they create a vagina, but what they're really doing is just creating a chronic open wound. And the reason you know that is because they always talk about how they have to dilate afterwards.
Correct.
The reason they have to dilate is because any wound has a tendency to close. That's how our bodies are made to heal. So they have to keep it open, and it's the fact that they have to dilate which goes to show it's not a vagina. This is a chronic wound that they're going to manipulate in order to scar so much that it permanently remains open.
Once you start manipulating tissue, you create scar tissue, which is not as inherently strong as regular tissue. And the more you manipulate tissue that's already scarred, the higher the likelihood of complications.
And that area that's tiger country. Operating in the area between the bladder, the rectum. I mean, I was there last week. It's a dangerous place.
It is.
You really have to be careful.
You really do. A female urethra, is about this long. A male urethra is about this long. So if you are a male and you have to dilate your urethra, that is putting something in your urethra every single day or even multiple times a day to keep an area open. Dilation is intensely painful. It is not a pleasant situation.
The surgeries they tend to elicit this emotional response because there's a lot of emotion attached to it, right? But the medications, they're tougher to understand, but I believe they're just as radical because these medications are strong. Remember, originally they're used for cancer patients with prostate cancer, right? This is a big deal. And the hormones too. These are irreversible changes because when you think about what a blocker does, puberty blockers, it prevents the release of a hormone that stimulates the process of puberty. And in the process of blocking the progression through puberty, what happens is like 1 million microsurgeries that happen every single day over the course of years. Because the changes are gradual and slow, people tend to be more accepting of it.
What you're talking about as a surgeon is the macro, what we can see. And I think we have to have that same fear of blocking normal hormonal pathways. What are we not seeing? What are we not seeing in terms of the emotional maturation of an individual?
Correct.
The intellectual capability of that individual being met? These are things that we have no clue on because these are molecular basis, but they're no less real. It's just that we can't see them.
These are the chemicals that lead to a result that's greater than the sum of the components. It allows us to perceive the world, to experience emotion, right? Like everything we felt during puberty was a result of hormones. It's an interesting thing about the GnRH, the hormone that's blocked by puberty blockers. The GnRH is blocked from the hypothalamus. The original meaning of the word hypothalamus is beneath the inner chamber. And I believe if there was one place that had originated the human soul, right, the endocrine system that allows us that ability to see the world, it would be the hypothalamus. And it makes sense that it would be named that because it's beneath the inner chamber, right? What do you want to protect? The most important thing in the world. You would hide it beneath the inner chamber. You would only intervene on it in the most radical situations, but not when they're children.
Could we talk a little bit about gender? Because, in medical school and we never used the word gender. We only used the word sex. And, I was in training in the 90s. And it seems to me that the word gender came into common usage circa 2010, maybe a little sooner, but maybe about 10, 15 years ago. What is your perception on that?
Okay, the word, we always in science and medicine spoke about sex and not gender. Gender, until not that long ago, was a word that it was a grammatical term. Okay, and it referred to, in certain languages, and Spanish and French and many other languages, nouns are male or female, or feminine or masculine is a better way of putting it, right? But that's where the word gender, that's where it came from. This is kind of a long and complicated story, but it's certainly, we have to mention Dr. John Money.
A psychologist originally from New Zealand. His primary area of interest was in hermaphrodites, what we now call intersex, a condition that afflicts one in about 5,000 infants. He was the first to open a clinic in the United States at Johns Hopkins University. He proposed that there's such a thing as an experience of being either male or female that is completely divorced from your body.
John Money's signature theory is that we are all born gender neutral, with the potential of living or identifying as a boy or a girl, a man or a woman, that we are blank slates, so to speak.
May I interrupt for a second? That's actually such a bizarre premise, because we are mammals like all mammals, and it's very clear when dogs are born or cats are born or horses are born that there's differences that are innate. They're not being so influenced by the environment as humans are being. It's actually a really bizarre premise.
Well, this was in the 50s and 60s. So it was before we had a lot of the knowledge that we have now about, prenatal hormones and development and so on. And he became, he put it out there not only to the scientific community, the mental health community, but to the lay community. I mean, it was covered by, Time magazine, and it became like a very big thing that he was extremely well-known, well-spoken, sophisticated professor. At that time, maybe not now so much, but the white coat, meant a lot.
The cultural climate of the 60s was ripe for ideas like John Money's. Ideologies like feminism that pushed the idea of no differences between the sexes began to proliferate at the time. Yet despite his notoriety, John Money had yet to prove his theory. That was until the Reimer family showed up to his office. The Reimers were a blue-collar family from Canada who gave birth to 2 healthy twin boys, Bruce and Brian. When the family decided to circumcise the boys, a malfunction caused Bruce's penis to be completely burnt off. Devastated, they decided to seek the help of John Money, the esteemed doctor from Johns Hopkins.
The Reimers see Dr. Money. The twins are about 1.5 years. He said to them, "You must raise Bruce as a girl. We're going to castrate him. We're going to do some preliminary genital surgery so that his genital area looks more like a girl. You're going to rename him, give him a girl's name, dress him in pink frilly dresses, give her dolls, and he's never to know that he was actually a boy." He's stating things in a definitive way, as if he has all the research, as if this is an established fact, which of course it was not. And this is a theme that we are seeing runs through the whole gender issue. And I really want to emphasize this because it is happening, Dr. Gold, to this day, to this very moment, that parents are being told and being instructed things as if they are established facts, which they are not at all.
Yeah, very good point.
Which is called fraud.
John Money began to present this case in the medical literature and to the public as proof of his theory. He was elevated as an incredible pioneer in our understanding of gender, and the case for the Reimer twins was proof of it. According to Money, Brenda was thriving.
This was all a hoax. Brenda was not doing well. Brenda was doing terribly. Okay, Brenda was never feminine. Bruce was even more masculine than his twin brother. He was aggressive. He preferred his brother's toys. He didn't want to wear dresses. He would pull his dresses off. Brenda did not fit in at all at school. The girls, they called her cave woman because of the way that she walked and the way that she talked was extremely masculine.
One of the things I was most struck about was that Brenda, who has no idea that he's XY male, would urinate standing up.
Yes. That is one of the most fascinating things, yeah. At a certain point, Bruce became suicidal. He realized he was attracted to girls. he had been in therapy for many, many years. The therapist and the psychiatrist that he was seeing knew the truth about him, misleading this poor boy and telling him he was a girl. But finally, there was one clinician, one psychiatrist that said, no, we have to tell him. We have to tell him the truth. And she met with the parents and she said, it's time. Your son is suicidal. We can't carry on this charade any longer. His first reaction, as he described later on in his life, was relief. Relief. I'm not crazy. I'm a boy. All his life, he had been engaging in this inner battle, internal battle, of trying to be someone that he wasn't. And finally, he was told the truth, and it was an incredible moment of liberation. And he immediately, at that moment, decided he was going to live as a boy. But you know what? He didn't go back to Bruce. He picked the name David. And he felt that up until that point, he had been like David fighting this monster Goliath in his life. And whether he meant the monster John Money or just the monster of, this fraudulent life, you could call it, the lie that he was a girl, this monster in his life, day in and day out. And he went back. He, of course, stopped the estrogen. He had surgery to remove his breast tissue, and he had quite a large number of surgeries on his genitals.
One might ask, what would possess someone to pursue such a radical experiment? An experiment that would affect the entirety of someone else's life. What kind of person would potentially destroy the life of an innocent child?
He was an extremely disturbed individual, disturbed and immoral. And he was disturbed, let's go with that first. It turns out that he himself had his own gender dysphoria, his own discomfort with being a man. And it all harkens back to being raised by an alcoholic father who would beat him and beat his mother. And this was John Money's, model of masculinity, this monster of a man. And he wrote about it openly, that he despised his manhood. And that is what we would call now gender dysphoria. And he wrote that he thought that the world would be better off if not only, he was raised on a farm, by the way, if not only animals, but young men were also gelded or castrated. Okay, so this gives us just a little window into his psychology of his own self-loathing as a man. So it's no wonder now it begins to make sense why he would come up with a theory that would be the solution to his distress. Meaning that even though you might be born with certain chromosomes and your body might say, I'm a man, it doesn't mean you're necessarily a man. It doesn't mean he's his father. He wanted, with all his being, to not be his father, his monster father. John Money died in the early 2000s, at which point his twin experiment was revealed as a complete failure, an utter failure, in that when Brenda reached adolescence and they started giving her, at John Money's instruction, estrogen so that she would grow breasts, and John Money started pressuring Brenda to have genital surgery to construct a vagina, and she just said, no way am I doing that. And she refused to ever go back. She and her brother refused to ever go back and see Dr. Money again. And it came out that during those visits, John Money was sexually abusing those boys. So on top of exploiting this poor family that had gone through a terrible tragedy and exploiting them for his own selfish egotistical reasons, because he wanted to be the great researcher, the great John Money, the great pioneer, gender pioneer, he was also abusing these kids and forcing them to look at pornography, forcing them to take off their clothes and assume different sexual positions with each other. Terrible, terrible things.
So we're talking today about what it means to be a doctor, and just because a person has a lot of diplomas and has earned the diplomas doesn't mean that a person shouldn't question, is this person sitting in front of me a doctor, as you understand the word doctor to be.
And the other thing, Simone, it's not just the individual doctors, it's the profession as a whole, because there were people that were speaking up against him and saying, hold on a minute. There's prenatal hormones, there's all kinds of things, other things we have to think about. He silenced them. He tried to make sure that their papers were not published. Okay, so people have to be aware that there are subjects, there are things within medicine that are being debated, but it's not being presented to them as if there's a debate. And that is precisely what's going on now with gender-affirming care. But I'm sorry to have to say that, our profession has lost its way. Right. And I don't care how many diplomas you have on the wall behind you. And unfortunately, parents and patients have to be aware of that. Right. And you have to ask questions.
The public's trust in modern-day institutions seems to be faltering, and for good reason. The infestation of unqualified people finding their way into positions of power is an unfortunate recurring theme. One such institution is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH. This organization concerns itself with maintaining the standards of care for people who suffer from gender dysphoria, and as such is hugely consequential for how healthcare professionals handle such cases. What was once an organization built on compassion and science-based therapy, this organization has now joined the ranks of the many other activist-led institutions. It has become activism over science, agenda over reality.
WPATH, they are setting the standard of care for these treatments. Oddly enough, those making the standards of care, you don't have to be a physician. Why are non-physicians setting standard of care for physicians?
It's like a cartel of medical negligence, because WPATH, which is the head of it, just launders their experts to organizations like the Endocrine Society, the AAP.
WPATH, in their standards of care, which are still widely used, but in the last century, their standards of care called for 2 letters from mental health practitioners before hormones were given. These are adults. Only adults we're talking about. 2 letters, and then 2 more letters before surgery for adults. And now, no letters. There's no letters. WPATH considers that gatekeeping. I don't want people to think that I'm minimizing the suffering of these people, because I'm not. I mean, the suffering is great, and they do deserve recognition of that, and they do deserve compassionate care. All I'm saying is that compassionate care is not these drastic, life-changing, destructive hormones and surgeries that have no science behind them. And they were just so radical. They eliminated any lower age limit. Well, we're talking about children being sterilized. So, and we've further learned in the past few weeks, actually, that they were urged to get rid of these lower age limits by none other than our Deputy Secretary of Health, Admiral Dr. Levine. Was discovered because of a lawsuit that's currently going on. There's an email that states that Dr. Levine would like these standards of care to be published as soon as possible, and so they went ahead and published them without any lower limits. The other thing that they did is they always used to have in their standards of care a chapter on ethics. Gone.
It is especially troubling that this Admiral Levine is pushing for the removal of age limits on these permanent and sterilizing mutilations. when he has spoken on national television programs stating how happy he is to have children, that he's so glad to have a family and couldn't imagine his life without them. But then he wants people who are 10 years old to determine that, for the rest of their lives, they'll be infertile. This is an individual who was allowed to grow up naturally and father his own children, and who says he loves being a parent, but yet he's perfectly okay giving drugs to 10-year-olds that will sterilize them and erase forever this possibility of human fulfillment. This is not only hypocrisy, it's insanity.
And there's a lot of people who've gone through these harms from doctors who are now bringing lawsuits. So they're shedding light in that way. There are people that are called detransitioners, people who've gone through medical, surgical transitioning, who are now speaking out. So I do think that a roundtable conversation like today, where doctors are speaking out about the concept of informed consent, are they really getting informed consent? What are WPATH standards? Have they changed over time? Who is running WPATH? Is it doctors or is it activists? And then are doctors really giving informed consent to the consenting party? I think our timing is very spot on this.
Gravely, this isn't the first time America's frontline doctors has been spot on with our timing. The 2020 COVID outbreak and the ensuing misinformation was the inciting incident that prompted me to begin this journey. To begin speaking out against the blatant government propaganda and the censorship of life-saving truth. From the onset, we knew that the 6-foot social distancing was fabricated. We knew that masks were ineffective, and we knew about effective early treatment solutions that were being suppressed. Our viral moment in front of the United States Supreme Court acted as a beacon in attracting the most ethical, truth-centered physicians. And it makes one wonder, what about those who did not heed the call? What about the others? If a legitimate doctor should presumably be a healer, a trainer, an educator, and a truth teller, what would describe a doctor who lacks these characteristics? What isn't a doctor?
Because I think we're seeing a lot of examples. I cannot say Dr. Fauci. I truly cannot. I just call him Tony Fauci. I don't think if you're lying to people, and I know that he's lied, to me that's not a doctor. So I'm kind of curious if you have an opinion or thoughts on what is not a doctor?
Being of German descent, I think of Mengele. And that has never become more apparent than these last 4 years and the Nuremberg Code and how we are, as a medical industrial complex, conducting experimental things on people without true informed consent. I see it as history repeating itself, and that is not a doctor to me. A doctor should constantly be questioning. They should constantly be living science and giving patients the ability to make those decisions, not taking the decision-making away from patients.
So a doctor is not someone who believes that reality is relative. It's not someone who refuses to debate opposition. A doctor is someone who is not afraid of the truth, does not have to conceal what they're doing behind closed doors. And a doctor is absolutely not someone who tells a child and their scared parents that unless you take these permanently altering blockers, hormones, and surgeries, that you're going to kill yourself. That is absolutely not what a doctor is. It's not even a few degrees away from what a good doctor is. This is the antithesis. It's an anti-doctor. It's anti-medicine.
A doctor is not an all-knowing being. Oftentimes physicians are good at biology, chemistry, physiology, but the concept of all-knowing just shouldn't be a part of the equation. A doctor is not a bully. A doctor doesn't betray the patients. They don't abandon them. For me, the character of a doctor is perhaps best represented by that person who, when they walk into a room, they don't announce, "Here I am." Instead, they say, "There you are."
So how do we protect ourselves? And how do we protect our children? We're at a critical point in our nation's medical timeline where we've more than forfeited the right to call ourselves the quote-unquote experts. Science, which should be a rigorous, skeptical, and systematic discipline, has now been warped and weaponized as a means of mass coercion. Many modern doctors are now acting at the behest of the state, behaving more like Soviet-style bureaucrats rather than healers, trainers, and educators. Political phrases like trusting the science or the science is settled are seemingly modern-day pagan mantras, with our children now sacrificed at the altar of the science cult. This total failure to protect our most vulnerable demonstrates how far we've veered. We cannot allow this any longer. We cannot be complicit. We need to take action. The law already recognizes that minors cannot consent to medical procedures that they do not comprehend. Yet, we are witnessing a dangerous breakdown of this principle. It is imperative for Congress to codify this into federal law and to ensure that children are shielded from suffering irreversible damage. No child, no matter what the circumstance, can fully comprehend the lifelong consequences of decisions like permanent sterilization, or forever losing the ability to orgasm, or forever losing the ability to breastfeed, or facing a lifetime of medical dependencies. These are decisions no minor is equipped to make. And no one, neither parent nor government, has the right to mutilate the healthy body of another human being. True informed consent can only be given by the individual themselves, and only when they reach the legal age to understand the consequences. This is common sense, and this must become the law. But we must go further. Legally speaking, medical negligence, wherein a doctor harms a patient, is considered malpractice, but gross medical negligence, where the doctor has clearly acted recklessly, is considered medical battery. This can occur when a doctor fails to provide true informed consent. Clearly, this is exactly the situation we are dealing with when it comes to children, and we must expressly call it what it is: battery. Doctors who knowingly have overlooked informed consent must face legal consequences. Not a slap on the wrist, not hidden behind the shield of medical malpractice insurance, but criminal prosecution. Medical battery is a violent crime, and it's time we prosecute it as exactly that. And it's time to name names. These are the worst abusers and offenders. These are the people who must be held accountable, who must be criminally charged with medical battery. These people and institutions are profiting from hurting children, and these numbers are only the tip of the iceberg. Now is the time for action. Sign the petition to ban medical mutilation. We must insist that Congress pass legislation to protect children. We must insist that they define and enforce true informed consent, and we must hold accountable those who betray their Hippocratic oath. Contact your representatives. Let's demand common sense federal statutes that protect the vulnerable from these irreparable harms. Our children cannot wait.
If you are ready to act now on behalf of these children, we urge you to support this film in the following 3 ways. Scan the QR code or visit whatisadoctor.org to learn how you can attend a showing free of charge, host a showing free of charge, and support this critical project financially to ensure we save as many children as possible. In addition, please sign the petition to ban medical mutilation by visiting whatisadoctor.org.